All right, welcome back to another episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Whitney from Falls Township PD in Pennsylvania, 38th year in law enforcement. Welcome to Words of the Wise, Chief Whitney. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, I'm really looking forward to it. I was hoping that maybe we could start with some background. Who are you? Where did you come from? Why law enforcement?
I had dual passions when I was younger. I was driven to make the world a better place. So initially, I thought I was going to be a physicist. So,
Okay.
18-year-old me thought I was going to Rutgers as a physics major, and I was going to make the world a better place by adding to our sum total of human knowledge. But that wasn't really meant to be. I kind of ran out of money, and even in high school, I had these dual passions. I went to high school in the 80s. So we were looking back on the events that happened during the 1960s and the civil rights movement. And I really felt like I wanted to make the system better from the inside. I really felt like, that could be something I could dedicate my life to, treating people well, treating people equally, doing a better job of it in policing. And that's kind of it drew me to this and it kept me in it.
Do you think that, because what I heard in both areas of passion, where you were thinking about being a physicist and now, of course, law enforcement, do you think that that was your driving why was to make the world a better place?
Without a doubt. And I
Mm.
would define that as our mission in policing. I have it on our letterhead. I think if we look at it that way, that we're here to make the world a better place, that will drive all of your behavior as a police officer. If you ever wonder, did I do a good job today? If you ask yourself, hey, did I make the world a better place? If the answer is yes, then you've done a good job that day.
Yeah, I really like that. And I was just having this conversation recently where someone asked me, how do you get people to do XYZ? And my response was, I've never had success telling someone what to do. But I think that rather than saying you should do this, it's posing that question of why is it important for you to do these things? And I think that when the why is strong enough, then the what and the how becomes a little bit easier. And so if you can always kind of come back to like, why are you doing this? Why is it important for you? Whether that's professionally or personally, then it's like, okay, well, what are those things that I have to do to accomplish that why? And you can kind of work backwards. And then in the hard times, you can also fall back on the why. Because I think sometimes we get lost a little bit in like the grind or the stress. But if you can always refer back to like, this is why I'm doing this, and this is why it's so important for me to keep going, then it makes that what and how a little bit easier.
I completely agree. And I think having that internal anchor for what drives you, and I think everybody wants to have meaning in their life. I think every human being wants to feel like that their life has meaning and that they're giving meaning or giving value to the world. And if you decide to become a police officer, your life has meaning every day.
Yeah, I really love that. So you started 38 years ago. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 38 years. And you and I were kind of talking about this a little bit offline, but this conversation about wellness has definitely changed. Even over the last 10 years, it looked so different. What have you seen as far as wellness? Maybe the difference between when you first started and now, and the conversations that we're having now compared to when you started?
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't be more different now. When I started, and I think the military and I think industry, I think, the world has seen this change. Maybe not defined it the same way that we are today, but I think the generations that are in the workforce have seen this change over time. When I came on, listen, you did what you were told, you kept your mouth shut. We're very, we're still mission focused and mission driven, but we really didn't give much thought to the trauma that, a first responder, a police officer is repeatedly exposed to. And it was kind of like, listen, be tough. We expect you to be tough and, don't complain and don't talk about it. So I think, for generations, policing in the United States was characterized by that kind of approach. And I think particularly in the last, 10 years, that conversation has changed. And I think in many ways we take a lot of our leadership dogma from the business world. So, we take a lot of ideas from strategic planning to wellness to everything in between from the business world. And I think the business world has for a longer period of time realized that, you know, a tremendous part of human resource management is taking care of your people and making sure they're okay. And I think it's a little bit harder in the public sector. It's taken us longer to come around to that. But I just like we've talked in the last 10 years, 10 years ago, if you said officer wellness, there was a groan throughout the room, in leadership training. And now it's just part of leadership training. It's something that we always talk about. And I think it's important for us to continue to grow as a profession and understand the importance of wellness because, as less and less people are attracted to this profession, we really need to hang on to the people that we have, and we need to make sure that they're okay and that they can not just survive but thrive, in their career in law enforcement and policing because it is a great job, but it does take a toll.
Yeah, I really love that you equated wellness to retention. Like, I love that you said, hey, like, right now, and I wouldn't say every agency, a lot of agencies across the country are struggling with hiring, and the pool is maybe smaller than it used to be. And there is an importance and a focus on recruitment, but also retention. And for you to say, hey, we need to make sure that our people who are here are good and that we're addressing the cumulative stress and trauma that is inevitable in this career. And I always like have this conversation with people. It's like not if, it's when, and it's how severe. And so, how can you be proactive? Like when you know that that is something that is coming, you're going to have hard calls, you're going to see hard things. If you know that that's coming, then how can you get in front of it to try to offload those things? And how can you make sure that everyone has the resources they need to be able to process those things? And like you said, I love that you said, thrive, not survive. I talk about this all the time. And I think that we get so stuck in these um, conversations that we typically have, and we don't like take a moment to like challenge ourselves a little bit in our thought processes. And I'm super guilty of this, where I used to talk about longevity all the time. I was like, longevity, that's it. That's what it's about. It's about longevity. And I still think longevity is really important, but how can we raise our bar of thinking and say, we want people to have long and successful careers and long and successful retirements, but we want them to live well. We don't want them to just survive, right? That's like
Right.
baseline. We want them to thrive. Like, how can we raise that bar and what does that look like? Because there's no point in having a long life if you are just crawling to the finish line and you feel terrible physically, mentally, emotionally, you're just not feeling good at all. No one wants that, right? So, how can we raise that bar and say, hey, we want you to live a long and successful life. We want you to feel good at the end of this and power walk to the finish line. And we want you to thrive, not just survive. So I really love that you said all those things because I'm like 100% on board with that.
Yeah, and I think to the extent that we talk about longevity, I think we would define a career in this business as, as people would say, a marathon and not a sprint. So, we make a long-term investment in an officer. And, who are we looking to bring on board? Well, I mean, we're looking for exceptional people, of course. But we're looking for people with a good heart. I mean, if you're a good person and you want to help people and make the world a better place, we could train you in everything else. That's easy. Um, but then, the idea is, okay, you're a good-hearted person who wants to make the world a better place, but you're going to get beat up along the way with everything that you see and do. So part of us training you to be successful in this career, this profession, is us training you that that's coming. So I think it's important to have that conversation right away and let an officer know that this is going to be challenging, and we're training you that it's going to be challenging because police officers are fantastic when we're trained to expect something. Where sometimes, there's opportunities for improvement is when we don't know it's coming. We had no idea it was coming. And now we're in a crisis when we could have pre-planned this and not made it a crisis. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid when we talk about officer wellness. We want to avoid an officer being in a crisis. We want to build in to that officer the resources that give them the resiliency to succeed at home and at work and as a human being with all the challenges that a first responder faces.
I'm curious to know because, right now I think we have two different buckets. We have the wellness bucket and then we have the training bucket. But what I just heard and what you were saying is that there's some like overlap in that, like how can you train your people to be well and prepare for these crises? How can wellness be a part of safety training? Do you think that there's ever going to be a day where both are the same thing, that wellness is training and training is wellness and they're all together? Or do you think that there's still going to be two separate buckets?
No, I think it's inevitable that they merge, and I think we have to deliberately do so. The one of the challenges, in our field is that we train for the possible and not the probable, right? Because we police an armed population. So, we have to be careful and we inculcate into a new officer all of these ideas of officer safety. And it's absolutely essential. And, we carry guns and wear body armor just to go to work. Um, but like in my town, we have a community that's tremendously supportive of us. So it's not that it can't happen, but it's improbable that bad things will happen. We're not a city, and it's one of the advantages to policing a suburb, right? But the training just kind of puts you in that hyper vigilant, very, very tense mindset. But if we don't do that, then something bad might happen to the officer. So I think part of our training has to be telling them the reason we're doing this, the reason we're giving you all this training is to make you safe and to make you effective at policing the community, to know the difference between a good guy and a bad guy, so to speak, and how to treat both. But we're also going to train you in what that does to you.
Mhm.
And, we don't have a switch. You can't turn that off and on, but there's a process that your body and your brain goes through. So when you go home, you're still not in that hyper vigilant state with your wife and your children. And, now you're experiencing, family stress, as a byproduct of the way that we approach this job and the training and what we see on the street. So I think we have to merge the two. And I think that's the only way we're going to be successful in building resilient officers that can maintain that good-hearted person that came into the job. They're still that same person at the end of 35 years when they leave the job. That's the challenge for us as leaders.
Yeah, I love that you said and being effective, being safe, being well, and being effective. And I think that if we can start merging the two, then that's a way to break stigma. Because I think right now, because they're so separate, it's like, oh, well, this is our training, that these are the things that like we have to do for our job. And then this is like wellness, and I think we've come a long way, but there's still some stigma for sure, residually across the country. Um, you know, I really relate it to like professional athletes a lot. And there's a really good series on Netflix. I'm sure anyone who's listening who's like into sports has watched it, but there's quarterback, wide receiver, like there's a couple different, and they follow these, really elite professional athletes throughout like a season. And they show you kind of behind the scenes of some of their training. And a lot of it is wellness. They're focusing on how can we be safe and effective, and at the top of our game physically. What does that look like? And they're working with PT, they're doing mobility, they're working out in the gym, they're doing all these things physically so that they're at the top of their game. And I relate this to your line of work because if you're not physically well, what does that do to performance, on the job, and safety on the job, right? And how can you be more effective physically? And then they also have like, you see them like they have therapists that they talk to. They're doing like breathing techniques, they're meditating, they're doing all of these things so that when they're under pressure, they have the tools and resources to be able to be calm and collected and make effective decisions and again be effective and at the top of their game. And that's just their training. Like they're not sitting here saying, okay, I gotta do my wellness training now. It's like, no, this is my like elite professional training that I have to do in order to stay here, at the top. And so I think that if that becomes more of the perspective of like, okay, all these things that we're doing in wellness is helping us on the job to be safe and effective. And like you said, this is also helping me to have a successful life. outside of the job. And I think that it's important to recognize that it's all interconnected. And if you feel better physically, mentally, emotionally on the job, and you have those tools and resources, you're also going to be able to fall back on those tools and resources when you go home.
No doubt. And I think having that kind of these concepts fully integrated into what we do in training, it will make us better. I mean, when you're under stress and pressure, you lose IQ points. Just telling somebody that makes it okay to realize, wait, I'm in a very stressful situation. I need to control my breathing. It gives you that self-awareness that allows you to function better. And to have that self-awareness at work and at home is equally important. So you have to realize, when you go home, part of my process when I go home is to kind of take the uniform off, and shift my mindset from, being a police officer, police chief to, being dad, or being a husband, and trying to go into that mode. Um, and I like to think that being good at one makes you good at the other. But there's times being stressed at one makes you stressed in the other role. And I think, just being aware of that can happen and how to deal with it is important.
Yeah. What are some of the conversations that you're having with your team? Maybe the younger officers that are just starting out, or, anyone really within your team as being more proactive in your wellness and, being able to have some of those strategies to, be able to disconnect when you're not at home, or excuse me, not at work. And when you go home, are there certain conversations or trainings that you do internally?
I actually start the conversation there. So when I have the privilege of making people's dreams come true and giving them their dream job as police officers. So I love that at this stage in my career, I could be the person that does that. And, when I meet with them and shake their hand and welcome them on board, we have a conversation. We talk about the fact that this is a lifelong commitment to be an occupational athlete. So physical fitness is an important part of this. But then I give them a book, by a man named Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. And he wrote a book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And, it's an easy read. It's got a lot of case studies in it. But I encourage them to read it and have their spouse read the book. And I tell them that, this is part of being trained to understand that being resilient is a very, very important part about being an occupational athlete as a police officer. And, maintaining that resilience and understanding the impact that this job, both the job itself and the training that we do in the job will have on you is just an important part of understanding the journey that you're about to undertake. And I tell them, and this is just the beginning of that conversation. It's not the end. Handing somebody a book doesn't solve, the wellness issue. But I like to think it makes it okay that, they're getting it from a police chief who started in 1988 when the whole world looked different, that I'm making it okay. That I'm sharing with them a little bit of my journey and my impressions of our job and, how I value this topic. And I hope that, the next generation will take it even further than I'm able to.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit offline is um, back, and I always commend you guys, who started 30, 40 plus years ago, because like you said, it wasn't a part of the conversation. It wasn't how you were raised. It was a different mentality entirely. But now, you are all in leadership positions and you're put in a position to have an open mind to new concepts and different ways of doing things. And that's not easy. It's not easy. Like, you see it like when you get older, like with my grandparents, I'm like, they're never changing. Like they're just like stuck in their ways for sure. And we kind of find ourselves in those positions if we're not careful of just being like, nope, this is the way we've always done it. And so this is the way we're going to do it moving forward, period. But everyone who's in leadership now, is like you that grew up in this generation where it was like, suck it up, tough it up, keep going. And now you're in these leadership positions to say, no, there's a better or a different way of doing things and having that open mind. And, I think that when you start out with wellness being a part of the conversation, it's not foreign anymore. It's normal, right? It's like, oh, like this younger generation's gonna be like, yeah, like we've talked about wellness from day one. I was handed a book and then we were reinforced those behaviors and those resources throughout my entire career. and then 30 years from now, they're in chief positions and they're like, yeah, like I'm going to continue to do those things and prioritize those things because those are things that have always been normal. So I think that there is going to be a shift that happens. And I think starting off on that, first initial like conversation of, hey, wellness is important and here's why is only going to set up future generations for success.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you can see it in leadership training. When I went through police leadership training in 2003 when I became a sergeant, there was no talk about officer wellness. That those were not terms that people put together, but starting about, 9, 10 years ago, and continuing to today, every time we send someone to leadership training, every time I go to leadership training, it is part of the conversation, part of the curriculum. So there's been a big change to have leadership understand the importance of it, and that's only going to continue. And I'm sure we'll have officer wellness training in police academies, so it won't just be agency specific that we're trying to make it a priority, but that it'll be, state specific in the criteria to become a police officer and be licensed in individual states. That will undoubtedly become part of the curriculum there as well.
Yeah. Can I ask you, because one of the conversations that has come up quite a few times is this challenge of having your entire command staff on board with wellness. And it's a challenge. A lot of people are challenged with having everyone kind of on the same page and with that shared mission. Is that something that you look for when promoting or looking to hire people in leadership positions, or how has that been for you? Because, I would imagine that that's challenging if you are like, yes, I believe in it, but then you have like a handful of maybe, other leaders who are like, woo woo witchcraft.
That's definitely a challenge in our field. And, when you take over as a police chief, even when you're an internal police chief, you inherit some people that got promoted and you didn't make that decision, and then you end up promoting people. And,
Mm,
part of deciding who is appropriate during a selection process um, are not just their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but how do they fit into the agency culture? Are they valuing what the organization values? And, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot is just this is just part of human resource management, like
mm,
understanding how to treat people and treating people with dignity, understanding that, toxicity in the workplace is just something that cannot be accepted by leadership. It can't be tolerated. Uh, and, I could say that all day long, but the person that really impacts the experience of an employee is their frontline supervisor, right? I mean, there's white papers written about that. The research indicates that, like in whatever job you're in, particularly policing, your sergeant really impacts, your experience as an employee. So we really talk a lot about that to develop our sergeants and to a lesser extent our corporals, but our sergeants in particular, so that they understand these principles and so that we're identifying, is there a skill gap here? Do they not understand that we can't talk to people the way we used to 30 years ago? That we have a different generation that's out there. And we're at a unique time. There are 5 generations in the workplace now, across all industries. So that creates challenges, and that's where you get sometimes that inertia that you're referring to, where, hey, that's not the way we used to do it. And we're missing the fact that it's not just our generation or the one that came after anymore. There's 5 generations in the workplace. So just the challenge of communicating effectively across those generations is a challenge that if you're going to succeed in it as a leader, you have to embrace the growth mindset and the fact that, you need to really be looking for what's happening everywhere and learning everything possible to be effective at that communication.
yeah, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think of the 5 generations, and I'm gonna probably be really sad. Is there something after Gen Z that's starting to enter into this workforce, or what are we looking at for 5 generations? We have boomers,
We have boomers,
and then we have millennials, right?
right? And then we've got Gen Xers, Gen Zers, and then this new
Gen
generation.
X, Gen Z, and what is the new one? It's Gen like Alpha or
I,
something.
I I've heard Gen Alpha, and I've heard other things that people have thrown out there. I think Alpha is probably the one that's going to stick.
Okay.
Um, but that's a big difference. I mean,
Yeah.
the perspective of the people that are growing up in those generations, whether it's a perspective driven by the change in the economy from an industrial economy to an information economy, the impact of technology, on every aspect of what we do, and in particular, the impact of technology just in my time in this job has been tremendous and certainly will continue to be so. And now we're dealing not just with technology, but with AI and how do we use AI, how to use it ethically, what are the requirements from our district attorney's office or the laws that govern privacy in our field. There's just a lot going on. So I don't know that there was ever a time as a police chief that you could kind of put your feet up and just relax. But if there was, it's not now.
I find it really interesting because you're 100% correct that and this is with anyone. You could have 100 people within the same generation and everyone's going to learn differently and everyone's going to react differently to certain things or understand things in different ways. And to be able to say one thing 1,000 different ways so that everyone understands like what you're trying to get across is extremely challenging. It's not an easy thing to be like, okay, well, if you don't understand it this way, let me say it this way. And if you don't get that, then let me say it this way. And so we talked about this a little bit offline, but I think one of the best parts of this podcast is talking about these conversations of wellness, but having a lot of different perspectives and ways to do things and ways to teach things and so that maybe one perspective doesn't resonate with one person, but another one does. And I think that's the beauty of this right now is having these conversations and really trying to solve the same challenges, across the board, but in different ways. And so I think it's really cool. And I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your perspectives. One of the things that you kept saying earlier, and I want to touch on this a little bit, is resiliency. You said resilient mindset, resiliency. What is your definition of resiliency?
So I think to be resilient is to embrace a growth mindset and never really be satisfied with what you're accomplishing or what you're learning. Like I'm a lifelong learner, so I'm always reading at least a book, always taking a course. Whether it's a skilled credential. In the training that we do a lot of skilled credential training in policing, or whether it's my educational journey and finishing degrees or taking classes online. Um, I think you always have to be hungry for information and hungry to better yourself. And if that's the kind of person you are, I think you've truly embraced a growth mindset and you tend to look at obstacles and failures as opportunities because there
Mm,
are always going to be problems. There's always going to be something that comes up that's, a disaster, whether it's a crisis in the community or a crisis in the organization. There are always going to be initiatives that don't succeed the first time. And if you're the kind of person that's like, oh, well, I tried, and have that kind of fixed mindset, then I think it leads to toxic behavior. It leads to just, oh, I'm burned out, I'm done, I'm tired of this, I'm just coasting, and we can't afford to have people coast in public service. We want to attract and train and maintain people with that growth mindset so they are resilient, so that we get that return on investment, for having an exceptional person come to us and look for a career, and then we put all this time and money and effort and emotion into making them an amazing officer. It just takes a little bit more time and a little bit more emotion to try to encourage them and help them embrace a growth mindset and be resilient. So when I talk about resilience, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. When you look at a setback or a failure, how do you view it? Do you view it as you're being victimized by that setback or that failure? Or do you view it as, well, this is an opportunity to grow? Maybe you don't get the promotion the first time, which I haven't always gotten the promotion the first time. I've been skipped. It's an opportunity to be better. Uh, I think that's really important for people, but I think it's really important in our business because there are going to be challenges. There are going to be members of the public who aren't happy to see you, even though around here most of them are. There are going to be bosses that you don't agree with. There are going to be district attorneys you don't agree with. There's always going to be something, a judge that saw it a different way than you did. There's always going to be some challenge. And if you frame that as a challenge and an opportunity, you'll maintain a resilient mindset. But if you frame it as that just was unfair, the world is wrong, I'm not being treated right, then you start to head down that road of becoming toxic, and it's horrible for you, it's horrible for your family, it's horrible for your career, So I really try hard to frame things that way with people.
I love that you said framing. Mental framing is something that is backed by science, and it's so effective. And I do think that perspective is everything, and there are a few things I wanted to kind of touch on, but one is, this idea of forward movement. And that's what I heard when you were talking about that is like, how can you learn from the challenges in life? How can you learn from your mistakes? I have fallen flat on my face so many times. Like and in public, where like things did not go well, or maybe I was criticized for something or whatever. And I would argue that I've learned more about how to develop myself and how to grow and how to like get back up and keep going from those times than I have from any sort of like successful opportunity that I've ever had. It's great when you feel like you're succeeding and you're getting all the yeses in the world. But I think like you said, how you grow is from the nose. Where do you go from that? What is your perspective? Is it like the end of the world and you give up, or is that an opportunity to improve yourself and come back stronger? And one of the definitions I heard of resiliency that I really liked is like, how quickly can you come back to baseline? So like after something bad happens, and we're all guilty of this, and I'm not saying that you can't have feelings, and that you can't like be disappointed or let down or embarrassed by something. Like those are all like human emotions and things that you're going to experience in your life, but how quickly can you get back up? How quickly can you get back to that baseline? And then how can you have that forward trajectory instead of that stagnation? And so I really liked that a lot. But my question for you, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, and I really think this is an interesting conversation, is the opposition of resilience. And I know you said kind of like being stuck or kind of, that like, going to put this in quotes, but like that victim mentality or like, oh, I'm just going to give up. I'm just stuck here. And I think that historically, there was always this idea that like resilience was toughness. And if you are not tough, then you are weak. And I would really like to know kind of your perspective on the opposition of resiliency and how we can reframe that, because I think that two things can always be true at once, and I'll kind of give you my perspective too, but I want to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
It's a really good point, and um, I think everybody needs to realize. I mean, just in life, as an entrepreneur and as a business person, you run into challenges and failures, and it's challenging in our industry because we don't embrace failure.
Mhm.
And there's a balancing contest there. Like we don't want to say we'll go out there and fail, because we're here to save lives sometimes, and you want to do your best. But even there, you're not always going to succeed. So I think it's important for us to discuss and to train, officers and leaders in what does it mean to fail. And I think for a lot of us, it starts on the individual um, call for service level, where I could recall, vividly, being on a call for service and thinking, man, that did not go well. I would sit in the police car and be like, what could I have done better to have created a better outcome in this call for service? And I would do that a year in here, just constantly trying to play the what if game and how could I have handled that better so I can improve as a police officer. And I think as leaders, we need to really model that behavior, um, and help people deal with the little failures that happen, or sometimes the big failures that happen. Sometimes that's a horrific incident, and it's devastating to people. And it's important that they know that there's help for them, um, and that that's part of the life that we're living in policing. That we're going to face these challenges, and a lot of the times those challenges people do better with than they do career challenges. You
Yeah.
know, in our business, if you don't get the promotion, like if there may be one promotion, right? And there may be 11 people taking that competitive exam and going through that competitive selection process to go through that and try to get that one promotion. And mind you, they were all exceptional enough to get through the door and work here to begin with. So we're not dealing with, an easy decision. And if there's 11 people for one job, well, 10 of them aren't going to get it. And everybody's going to watch those 10. And what do you do? How do you handle that? And that it's important, to recognize that little failure, that's a leadership challenge. And I've been there. I've been the guy who didn't get the promotion. And it's like, well, man, this hurts. It's like getting kicked in the stomach. And you've still got to come to work, and you've still got to kind of take some deep breaths and maybe run an extra mile on the treadmill, and do what you can to get kind of those upset feelings out. It's the astronauts went through the same thing. There's a selection process for the first 7 astronauts, and then everybody made it. They only picked 7. You get a lot of type A fighter pilots and people who are used to succeeding, and like, what do you mean they didn't make the first team? That's a challenge. But when you have a growth mindset and you realize, well, you know what, maybe I should go and talk to the boss and find out, hey, what can I do to succeed next time? And there's going to be a next time. And for me, there was a next time. There was always a next time. I didn't make it. I made it 3 years later. You know, and had to have that global perspective helps. That whatever you're dealing with today that didn't turn out the way that you wanted, there's going to be a next time. And the question is, are you going to be more amazing between now and next time, or are you going to be angry and bitter and cynical between now and next time? Because going down that other road, the angry, cynical, bitter road, who wants that as their boss, or who wants that person to show up at their door when you call 911? You know, that's, I think we need to help people frame things that way, and that'll build the kind of resilience that we're talking about.
Yeah, I like it. I know I'm gonna refer back to like sports again. And I don't normally do this on the podcast, but I think that one, there has to be self-assessment always. Even if you did get the promotion, could you have done things better still? Is there an opportunity for you to be even better even when you're succeeding? Not settling for where you are now ever. And how
Oh,
can
absolutely.
you be like, everyone says like 1% better every day. But just because you quote unquote fail or you have a challenge or you have like a human emotion to something does not mean that you are weak. And I think that a lot of times that has been the perception of like, okay, well, if you trip and fall, or if you don't get that promotion, or if you see something and something's hard and you cry, like that doesn't mean that you are a weak person. Like maybe you are having a hard time right now, but that doesn't mean that you're not, tough or resilient. And one of the things that someone told me, and this is going back to the sports, you have how many people in the NFL, and at the end of a season, there's only one team that's happy. Everyone else, quote unquote, failed, right? Like there's one goal and it's to win the Super Bowl. That's it, right? And aside from that one team, everybody else, it feels like they failed. And you see this all the time, people losing games, important games, and they're crying on the sideline.
Sure.
They're upset. But do we look at them and say, man, that guy's weak or he's not elite? Like, never, right? It's like, wow, that's a
Sure.
human emotion to being disappointed in what happened, and feeling like you failed. But then do you see those players the next year being like, well, we didn't make it to the Super Bowl, so we're just going to give up? No, like they spend the whole off season like resting, they are training, they're trying to figure out, they're looking at their videos from the year before and they're having that self-assessment of like, okay, how can we be better? How can we improve? What do we need to do for the next year so that we can come back stronger? And I think that that is, and I've heard this before on this podcast, and it's kind of a common saying of like failing forward. How do you take that opportunity to fail forward? And the people who did win the Super Bowl, they're not resting either. They were at the top of their game and they
Right.
won. Like they were the ones that won. And at the end of the day, they're like, we want to win again. How can we be even better? Because everyone's out for like to get us this year, so we want to prove ourselves again. And how can we be even better than we were last time? And so I think it's this idea of like, just because there are setbacks or things don't happen the way that you want them to, maybe you cry, maybe you're sad, maybe you're frustrated. It doesn't mean that you're weak. How can you have that self-assessment regardless if you're winning or losing? And how can you improve yourself as much as you possibly can? And like you said, that cognitive reframing or that mental reframing of what failure actually means and how you can become better over time.
Yeah, I think I think it's a great analogy. And I think in our business, we need to look at the times that maybe we didn't get what we wanted as an opportunity for a new stretch goal. You know,
Mhm.
how do I improve? And I think if you truly embrace a growth mindset, your brain will take you there. It just kind of gets there. It might take a day or two. You might be disappointed. You might, like I said, run an extra mile on the treadmill, because it is okay to be disappointed and it's very human to be upset. And I think that's another thing that we're increasing our awareness of in our field. Um, Understanding emotional intelligence and understanding, um, that people are human and what does that humanity look like in the context of policing. I think we are improving in that regard. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think that will continue over time and we'll be better for it.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that for a minute. And, you and I talked about, um, having more of that emotional intelligence within the organization, but also within the community. And how do you teach that? And I know that a lot of agencies are in the same position where a lot of the calls within the community are mental health calls. And so it requires some of that like empathy and emotional intelligence within the officer to be able to respond to the community. But then also organizationally, when you're building a culture of wellness and support, it also takes emotional intelligence and empathy to support each other and to build that culture. I would love your insights on one, how do you create culture within an organization that is supportive of these things? And how do you teach emotional intelligence, especially to someone who is maybe younger in their career and doesn't have a lot of lived experience yet?
So I think we've been mission driven in policing forever, right? And people in my generation would say, well, the mission's out there in the community. So if we're treating the community in a way that doesn't empathize with their suffering. If we're just like, well, that's their problem, this isn't a police issue. I'm not going to get involved. Well, that bleeds over into how we treat each other in the workplace. So I think the way to do this with most cops, I would say, is to make it part of the mission out in the community that we're dealing with people. There are people, whether you live or work in Falls Township, if you're here and I'm on a call for service, you're my people. And I'm here to make your day better because I'm trying to make the world a better place and I'm trying to make your world a better place today. And that brings with it a certain compassion and a certain empathy. And now we have options. When I got hired, listen, we arrested people, we didn't arrest people. It was really kind of simple, like, am I doing this? Am I not doing this? Is there a crime? Is there not a crime? It was a very kind of black and white way of looking at the world. But that didn't work too well. And a lot of people fell between the cracks. And now when we go out, we have resources in the community that we can refer people to. We have a co-responder that's a trained social worker that can help. I've hired officers that have a background in social work, who used to be social workers. So, we have this awareness that we can now connect people that aren't involved in criminal activity. They're just not okay today and they need our help. Well, that's okay. That's a legitimate call for service. When we embrace that, it finds its way into our culture as an organization, not just externally out there with the community, but then with each other as well. Where
Mm.
now, the conversations about officer wellness that we see in leadership training, translate into what we talk about in roll call and the investment that we make in leadership training for those frontline supervisors, the sergeants and the corporals. Our hope is that they align themselves with the organizational values now. If one of their officers is having a hard time, talk to them about it. Let's give them support. So that's what we need. That's the direction we're going in. I think that's the way to get there. I think if you show officers that, listen, it's part of the mission. We're not going to ignore people who are suffering. Well, if we're not going to ignore people who are suffering out in the community, then why would we ignore our own people who are suffering? It just doesn't make sense. That
Mm.
was not the case, almost 40 years ago, on either side, whether out in the community or in the building. But I think as we have become more compassionate with people out in the community, it's bled into the organization, so to speak, and we've become more compassionate with each other.
I really like that concept, and I don't know if I've ever had anyone explain it in that way, but it makes complete sense. The more you train something, then the more you're going to implement that thing that you're training. And so I love that you said it bleeds and that they work together. And I would also imagine that it goes back the other way. It's like the more compassion and the more supportive that you feel within the organization, then the more you're gonna, be able to pour into the community. And then the more the community pours back into you, the more, and so it's just this ever
Sure.
like cycling. I really like how you said that. I have taken more time than I have asked, so I want to ask you one final question, and this is for the younger generation. What words of wisdom would you share with someone who's earlier in their career? Maybe something you wish you would have known earlier or something that has helped you along the way.
I think what I would suggest to anybody coming into this is to truly embrace a growth mindset. And by that, I mean for a young person, maintaining friendships that are outside of policing, staying in touch with people that are just part of your network. Don't just you know, isolate yourself into only associating with people at work. There's a great social component to policing that is helpful and is necessary in joining this occupation. But it's important to have a broader perspective, and whether that's reading about different fields or whether it's taking classes in different topics, I think maintaining a more global community-based perspective will help you build that resiliency that will truly help you at the end of your career be just as excited to come to work as you were day one.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.